My name is Lauren Baylor. Today is April 4th. The time is 3:53 p.m. and we are at St. John's Northwestern Military Academy. I am interviewing Edward Tyre, who was born on March 16, 1924 in Maywood, Illinois, and served in World War II between 1943 and 1945. Edward Tyre was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and served as a bomber pilot. This interview is sponsored by the Bell Tower Memorial. How did the beginning of the war affect your daily life?
Pardon?
How did the beginning of the war affect your daily life?
Well, the original part of it was I was still in high school. I was a junior at Proviso High School when the war actually started. I didn't graduate till the following year in '42, and by then the draft was going crazy and everybody was eligible for the draft. And I went down and signed up for the Air Force, the Air Corps as it was called in those days. And I was told then that probably would be called up in maybe March or April of '42. And sure enough, came April of '42, I was called up into service. And '43, I'm sorry, '43. '42, I was still in high school. I was 18 years of age when I was called up. And I went down to Texas. First place was a huge base down there. And it's where all inductees went to school, like it was primary, and everything was taught down there. And after you were there for about 9 weeks, they put you through the standard basic Army drills and everything. Then you branched out and you selected what you wanted to do. And of course, everybody wanted to be a pilot. Well, they only took so many of them because the schools were limited as to what they could handle. And luckily, I was selected and went through a bunch of tests down in San Antonio. And the first thing they did was ship us off to a college. They had to have college. Well, I was just out of high school. And I went to Centenary College down in Shreveport, Louisiana. I was there for about 6 months. And then an opening.
What kind of classes did you take at the college?
Just freshman classes, freshman English, freshman arithmetic, and all the basic. They kept the civilian school teachers there. We just took over the lodging facilities. And there was no men at the college at all, just the draftees and the enlisted personnel who were attending the school there. And I went through 6 months of school classes, and then they had an opening in San Antonio. And San Antonio was a large Air Force base where all the schools were started at, actually, and everything fanned out from there. And when you were in San Antonio, you were screened every day that you were there. They were overlooking all the traits that you might have had and everything else. And we went through all kinds of testing and psychological and physical and everything else. And this is where they washed out quite a few of the guys who had anticipated being in flight school. I survived that, and then I went on to Bonham, Texas. and that's where I got my first touch of flight school. There we had the PT-19s, and we were taught how to fly them, and we go to ground school constantly every day. And we were there for about 3 months. I think you were at each school.
Can you tell me more about those early weeks of training?
The what?
Those early weeks of training, can you tell me some more about those first weeks?
The
First weeks of your training
oh,
with the planes?
the training itself.
Yes.
Well, it was primarily we had civilian instructors, flight instructors, and civilian school instructors, and everything was done in a hurry. You can see they just had makeshift hangars there on the field, and makeshift barracks, and everything was done like there was no tomorrow. So we were only there for about nine weeks, I think, is what we spent in primary school. And then we went on to those that survived it. And that's where we got our first touch of flying. And they were in the PT-19s, the open air cockpits, and they had a ground speed of about 120 miles an hour, a landing speed of about 60, I think. And after 8 or 9 hours in them, you were certified to try to solo in them. I can remember my first solo ride was this instructor picked me out of 80 students that he had and said, Tyre, you take it up today for the first time by yourself, which I did, and I went through all the takeoffs and got back down, and in landing it, he had not given me really what to do once you get the wheels on the ground. I figured you just let go and away it goes by itself. Comes to a stop. Well, it doesn't come to a stop. There's momentum, and the propeller's still whirling away. And I ground looped my first solo, which is bad to me, but the instructor met me at the end of the runway, and he jumps on board the plane and grabs the joystick, is what they would call the stick that came up between your legs. And damn it, Tyre, I told you how to do this. And he slaps one side of my leg to the other side, and everything he wanted to emphasize, he would slap my legs with the stick. Now get up there and do it the right way. So, okay. So I took my second shot at it, and I got it down, and it got prescribed landing, straight ahead, control all the way to the end of it. And that's as close as I come to getting washed out of the program. Guys got washed out of the program for simply cutting their hair too short. I can remember one day, one guy was there, and I noticed he had his hair was shaved, his head was shaved. And 2 days later, he was gone from the program. They just didn't want those kind of people, I guess. Anyway, from there I went to basic training, and we got our first twin engine, not the twin engine, it was a two-seater plane, and but it had a canopy on it, and it had a radio. We didn't have any radios on the little planes in basic, and everything was tower controlled. All your runways and takeoffs and landings were all tower controlled. And I can remember I got and the first instructors, all the instructors were Air Force. The instructors at the primary school were all civilian instructors. And this one guy, I don't know if he was looking for a thrill or what, he took us up one at a time, and went through his drill of how to handle the airplane, landing and so forth. And then he took us up and went through a bunch of stalls. That's where the airplane, you hold the nose up until it just quits flying and falls away from you and it's out of control. And you have to get it back under control. And that was a thrill. And this was one instructor I had took me up especially, and put me in a 13-turn spin. And at the end of it, he was yelling for us to get out of it. You know, just use the controls, and you got to do everything by the numbers, and you end up coming out of the controlled spin, and you have control back of the airplane. That's one of the most exciting things I've ever been in. I would not do it again. You lose control of the airplane. And then we went on to primary and basics training. Then we went on to the next class of flying, which was advanced school. And this is where you had your chance to, by this time you've been flying for about 6 months already, you had your choice of going into multi-engine or single engine. And I chose multi-engine because I figured it was safer with twin engines. But that's not the case. And we went to Shepherd Field, Texas. And no, I take it back. It wasn't Shepherd Field. It was Lubbock, Texas, for the final phase of flying. And this is where we flew twin-engine planes and took long hops through Texas and all over the country as far as gas would go. And this is basically where you learn to fly a big bomber like I ended up flying, was at that school. And I remember the day I graduated, and everybody graduated with you were second lieutenants then in the Air Corps. And from then on it was yes sir, no sir, and all that kind of stuff. And when we were at Barksdale, I noticed they had B-26s were there, and they were going through a training phase of the crews. Their crews were assembled, and then I found out later that they were assigned to a pilot, a co-pilot, and right on down the line to the gunners, and you trained as a crew in the B-26, which was a high-speed bomber that was being used in, well, it was originally used over in New Zealand and around the islands over there. And then they moved it to Africa. And the group that I joined eventually had been in Africa. And of course, in those days, when you were assigned to a group, you stayed with them until the war was over. There was no 5 or 6 months or something, and you move on to a different group. So all the guys that I met then were from Africa and the war in Africa, and then they moved up to Italy, and I joined them just at the tail end of the war in Italy. And the funny part of this, we were granted a brand new airplane from the factory. We had to go to Georgia to get it. And from Georgia or North Carolina, we went down to West Palm Beach, Florida. And then we were considered overseas at that point. And what I didn't realize was that if you go overseas as a married person, they give you an allowance. And if you go overseas as a single person, you don't get the allowance. Well, Jack, our first pilot, he and I were the same age. We were both 20 years old. And he married his wife at the point about a week before we got to Georgia. And so he would go overseas and collect a pension or she would collect a pension as a married wife of an officer. That was an aside.
Can you tell me how you adapted to military life?
The what?
How did you adapt to military life?
Well, it wasn't easy, but the first thing you did when I was discharged from the Air Force back in '45. I was kept in reserve, that's all, and given no particular duties. But what was your question?
How you adapted to military life?
Oh, military life?
Yes.
That was easy. You did everything they said when they said it. And you didn't really have to think for yourself. The food was always there. The job was laid out for you, what you were going to do for the next 20 minutes or hour.
What tour did you serve in?
Pardon?
What tour did you serve in?
In Europe.
Europe? Okay.
Yeah, over in the ETO, yeah. And that came after about 6 months at Barksdale Field, where we gathered a crew together, and we trained as a crew in the B-26. Went through special flights. They had a very, very long runway at Barksdale. It was 10,000 foot. At that time, it was unusual. And you could have takeoff and have a single engine on takeoff and still correct it and stop and get out of the plane in time to avert a tragedy. But that was the only deal outside of Barksdale that was good about it was the facility that they had there. And then we picked up the plane in Georgia, actually, in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. We picked up a brand new airplane from the factory. And then we flew it to West Palm Beach, Florida. And then we were considered overseas, but our mailing address had an APO on it and everything else. And we sat around in Florida waiting them for weather and some repairs to the plane. They had to install a special gas tank in place of the bomb bay. They unhitched all the bomb bay equipment and put in a 500-gallon tank because we were going to make a run from South America out to Ascension Island, which was 1,500 miles. Now, the plane only carried enough gasoline to go 1,000 miles. So they gave us this extra 500-mile with a special tank that they put in where the bombs were. And when that got installed, it took away, it added some weight to the overall weight of the plane, which cut the distance down. And so actually the traveling distance was around 1,400 miles. And the distance from Natal, Brazil to this Ascension Island was around 1,250 miles or something. So you landed with 150 miles of gasoline left in the plane, which is only about 40 or 50 gallons of gas. And then you started hearing the rumors about in the Atlantic, the Germans had submarines that would send a signal that would overcome your radar, and it would send you out. You would miss Ascension Island. You would just go by it, really, and misdirect it and end up in the Atlantic Ocean. We never had any problems like that. We had one navigator in the lead plane, and the other 5 or 6 planes would follow the lead plane going from destination to destination. And we got to Ascension Island okay, and then we went to where they just had the terrible disease went through there. It's on the southern tip of the continent of Africa. And we made that okay. That was another 1,200 miles. And from then on, they were all easy jumps. We went up to Dakar, Africa, and to Marrakesh, and then to Tunisia. And that was the other thing. They gave us our orders as we left West Palm Beach and said you're not to open the orders till you're 1 hour away from the United States. Well, every plane that I know had opened the orders on before the wheels were up on West Palm Beach. And we had orders that took us to Tunis. And that's where they ended, in Tunis. Well, there was no war going on in Tunis at the time, so we figured that we were going to Italy or someplace like that, and that's exactly where we ended up, was in Naples, Italy. And we left the plane there, and they just, with a massive about 500 brand new B-26s that they parked. Our 6 more planes were there. And then a C-46 picked us up and took us to the island of Corsica. And that's where we were stationed for about 4 or 5 months till, well, we got there in September, and we didn't leave Corsica till Christmas. And in the meantime, we were flying missions out of Corsica into northern Italy. The Germans had a rail line that came from Germany into Italy, and that's how they were bringing war supplies into Italy, was with this railroad. And our job was to keep the line shut down. You would bomb bridges over rivers and just rail lines or wherever they were exposed. And the Germans were very good. They knew you were coming, and the rail line went from Italy to, it went from Germany down through Italy, and it went through the mountains areas up there. And there, because of the height of the mountains, they couldn't put the rail lines up there. They had to put them in the valley. And so they knew you were coming in the valley, and they were waiting for you every day. And that's, I don't know if any of you have heard of Axis Sally. She was a reporter that had turned traitor to the United States, and she was on the Italian radio. And she would, it was just a regular FM radio program. And she would play music, and so that was the only way we had of getting any music, was tuning in her. And she would say, today the 17th Bomb Group will be coming into Italy, and we'll be waiting for you. And they were. And I only had 6 or 7 missions in Italy, but they were probably the most heavily defended. Well, they knew that you were after the railroad line, so they were all concentrated up and down the railroad line, or wherever it crossed a river or something, a bridge or something like that. So volume of anti-aircraft was always waiting for you at the target. And hardly a mission of which I flew 6 or 7 missions, 6 missions I think in Italy, that the plane wasn't damaged in some way. I can remember one of them was I was flying co-pilot, and the engineer would hang in the doorway leading to the radio room. And he, this day, all of a sudden he was standing there and he says, I'm hit, I'm hit, I'm hit. And he's got red fluids in his hand. Well, a piece of anti-aircraft had come into the cockpit and cut a hydraulic line, which the hydraulic fluid was colored red. And so he assumed that he had been shot. Well, he wasn't.
Can you tell me what an average mission was like?
That was about the 5th or 6th mission I was on. And then we moved up to France. And that was in Dijon, France. We were assisting the 3rd Army, I believe. The 3rd Army was over there. And they had the southern part of the line. They still hadn't crossed into Germany yet. This was in September, October of '44. So most of our missions were up to the front of the Siegfried line, or see, we supported troops. We were not after oil dumps or stuff like that. Our effective range was such that we would have to go after the German troops. And I can remember one of them, the first time I ever saw bombs going off on the ground was in Oos, Germany. And it was a rest area for the German army. And they would bring various brigades in there for so many days of rest and recuperation. Well, that was the first time I saw any kind of explosives go off, was that raid. I saw them blowing apart. They designed the raid so we got there at lunchtime. So they figured most of the guys would be hanging around the lunch area. And so they blew that whole assembly all to pieces. And yeah, that was Oos. That was on December 30th of '44. And then we would go after railroad lines and bridges and any military targets that you would think of. The only thing that they would not let us do if we could not drop our bombs, for whatever reason, it usually was weather. You couldn't see the target. In those days, you didn't have radar. So everything was done visibly. If the bombardier saw the target and got it in the sight, well, that was a successful mission. If you couldn't find the target, though, you brought them back. And we just never dumped the bombs out of the plane anywhere in Germany. You had to have a military target to dump them on. Well, most military targets were the railroad lines. Any railroad line was considered a military target. So several of our missions ended up blowing up railroad lines.
What do you consider your most important contribution during your service? Your most important contribution during your service?
Oh, probably was the raid on Schweinfurt, where the Germans had accumulated all of their communications system in Schweinfurt, or one of the headquarters was Schweinfurt, was one of the big monopolies of radio and telephone and everything. And bombed Schweinfurt, and I don't remember when the hell that was. In April of '44. And we bombed it so thoroughly and that brought it to a standstill. Actually, the American troops that were capturing the town claimed that they didn't have one casualty at all. They just walked right in and took over the town of Schweinfurt because we bombed it so completely. That was, we got the Distinguished Service Medal ribbon for that. Anybody who was in the squadron at the time got to wear that. This one here is the French Legion of Honor. This is put out by France very rarely, and I'm proud to wear it, really. Yeah.
Share with me an example of strong leadership you encountered during your service.
The what?
An example of strong leadership during your service.
I still didn't get your question.
Can you share with me an example of strong leadership?
Oh, strong leadership.
Yes.
Well, I think anybody who was a pilot, you were in charge of 7 men usually, in our bombers anyway. And then if you were one of the lead pilots, you had the bombardier with you, and everybody dropped their bombs off of him. You did not automatically go in there and find the target yourself. It was always one of 6 planes that had the bombardier, and it had the bomb sight in it too. The others didn't have a bomb sight. There was very much shortage of those.
Do you want to talk to me about these pictures that you shared with us?
This picture was taken when we moved to France. We took over a chateau that the Germans had used themselves as headquarters, and it was the count that owned the hotel was in German captivity, and we just had all the offices they turned the bedrooms into offices, and the dining room was turned into an officers club, and I met the Count after the war. He was brought over to this country, a little guy, part of the French dignitary hierarchy. He was in German control. He was captured and put in a German prisoner camp for the war.
What about these pictures? Can you explain those?
These are bomb photos of the bombs hitting. That's what they use to assess the damage that you do. And people think you get air medals for nothing. You don't. They didn't issue an air medal, flying a medal, unless you had 2 100% missions. That means every bomb in every plane that was in the flight had to drop on the target. And the target they gave you was 200 foot in circle. So it was, you were paying attention. And you were flying the formation, this picture here is a formation of the formation that would fly. Three and three made up a flight. 6 bombers made up a flight. And 6 bombers you had 1 navigator and 1 bombardier. And everybody else dropped when they saw the bombs leave the lead plane. That was your incentive to drop the bombs. And if for some reason you couldn't drop a bomb over the target, you were allowed to drop them on railroad lines or railroad stations, but most of the times guys would bring them back and drop them in a lake near the base.
Can you talk to me about this book?
Pardon?
Can you talk to me about this book?
But the plane?
About the book?
Oh, the book is,
Yes.
that was done by my son, a Navy captain. And also, he teaches here at St. John, aerodynamics, and very much interested in aviation.
Is there
And-
anything else you'd like to share with us today?
No, I'm glad to be here.
Okay. What are some life lessons you learned from military service?
I'm sorry, what?
What are some life lessons you learned from military service?
Well, I learned discipline in a hurry. And you learn cooperation is very, very important on whatever you do. And I guess comradeship is also a big part of it. I made a couple of friends that I still contact. One lives in California, and one lives down in Chicago. And you make lifelong friends there. You really do.
All right. In closing, this has been an interview of Edward Tyre regarding his service during World War II. My name is Lauren Baylor. The time is 4:30 p.m. Thank you for agreeing to this interview, and most importantly, thank you for your service.
Well, you're quite welcome, really. Really.